Swann's Way, Overture, Part 4. I was well aware that I had placed myself in a position than which none could be counted upon to involve me in graver consequences at my parents' hands, consequences far graver, indeed, than a stranger would have imagined, and such as, he would have thought, could follow only some really shameful fault. But in the system of education which they had given me, faults were not classified in the same order as in that of other children, and I had been taught to place at the head of the list, doubtless because there was no other class of faults from which I needed to be more carefully protected, those in which I can now distinguish the common feature that one succumbs to them by yielding to a nervous impulse. But such words as these last had never been uttered in my hearing. No one had yet accounted for my temptations in a way which might have led me to believe that there was some excuse for my giving in to them, or that I was actually incapable of holding out against them. Yet I could easily recognize this class of transgressions by the anguish of mind which preceded, as well as by the rigor of the punishment which followed them. And I knew that which I had just done was in the same category as certain other sins for which I had been severely chastised, though infinitely more serious than they. When I went out to meet my mother, as she herself came up to bed, and when she saw that I had remained up so as to say good night to her again in the passage, I should not be allowed to stay in the house a day longer. I should be packed off to school next morning. So much was certain. Very good. Had I been obliged the next moment to hurl myself out of the window, I should still have preferred such a fate, for what I wanted now was mamma, and to say good night to her. I had gone too far along the road which led to the realization of this desire to be able to retrace my steps. I could hear my parents' footsteps as they went with Swann, and when the rattle of the gate assured me that he had really gone, I crept to the window. Mamma was asking my father if he had thought the lobster good, and whether Monsieur Swann had had some of the coffee and pistachio ice. I thought it rather so-so, she was saying. Next time we shall have to try another flavor. I can't tell you, said my great-aunt, what a change I find in Swann. He is quite antiquated. She had grown so accustomed to seeing Swann always in the same stage of adolescence that it was a shock to her to find him suddenly less young than the age she still attributed to him. And the others, too, were beginning to remark in Swann that abnormal, excessive, scandalous senescence, meet only in a celibate, in one of that class for whom it seems that the great day, which knows no morrow, must be longer than for other men, since for such a one it is void of promise, and from its dawn the moments steadily accumulate, without any subsequent partition among his offspring. I fancy he has a lot of trouble with that wretched wife of his, who lives with a certain Monsieur de Charlus, as all Cambrai knows. It's the talk of the town. My mother observed that, in spite of this, he had looked much less unhappy of late. And he doesn't nearly so often do that trick of his, so like his father, of wiping his eyes and passing his hand across his forehead. I think, myself, that in his heart of hearts he doesn't love his wife any more. Why, of course he doesn't, answered my grandfather. He wrote me a letter about it, ages ago, to which I took care to pay no attention, but it left no doubt as to his feelings, let alone his love for his wife. Hullo, you too! You never thanked him for the Asti, he went on, turning to his sisters-in-law. What? We never thanked him? I think, between you and me, that I put it to him quite neatly, replied my Aunt Flora. Yes, you managed it very well. I admired you for it. said my Aunt Celine. "But you did it very prettily too. Yes, I liked my expression about nice neighbors." "What! Do you call that thanking him?" shouted my grandfather. "I heard that all right, but devil take me if I guessed it was meant for Swann. You may be quite sure he never noticed it." "Come, come, Swann is not a fool. I am positive he appreciated the compliment. You didn't expect me to tell him the number of bottles, or to guess what he paid for them." My mother and father were left alone, and sat down for a moment. Then my father said, "Well, shall we go up to bed?" "As you wish, dear, though I don't feel in the least like sleeping. I don't know why. It can't be the coffee ice. It wasn't strong enough to keep me awake like this. But I see a light in the servants' hall. Poor Françoise has been sitting up for me, so I will get her to unhook me while you go and undress." My mother opened the lattice door which led from the hall to the staircase. Presently I heard her coming upstairs to close her window. I went quietly into the passage. My heart was beating so violently that I could hardly move, but at least it was throbbing no longer with anxiety, but with terror and with joy. I saw in the well of the stair a light coming upwards from Mamma's candle. Then I saw Mamma herself. I threw myself upon her. For an instant she looked at me in astonishment, not realizing what could have happened. Then her face assumed an expression of anger. She said not a single word to me, and, for that matter, I used to go for days on end without being spoken to, for far less offences than this. A single word from Mamma would have been an admission that further intercourse with me was within the bounds of possibility, and that might perhaps have appeared to me more terrible still, as indicating that, with such a punishment as was in store for me, mere silence or even anger were relatively puerile. A word from her then would have implied the false calm in which one converses with a servant to whom one has just decided to give notice. The kiss one bestows on a son who is being packed off to enlist, which would have been denied him if it had merely been a matter of being angry with him for a few days. But she heard my father coming from the dressing-room, where he had gone to take off his clothes, and to avoid the scene which he would make if he saw me, she said, in a voice half stifled by her anger, "Run away at once. Don't let your father see you standing there like a crazy Jane." But I begged her again to come and say good night to me, terrified as I saw the light from my father's candle already creeping up the wall, but also making use of his approach as a means of blackmail, in the hope that my mother, not wishing him to find me there, as find me he must if she continued to hold out, would give in to me and say, "Go back to your room. I will come." Too late. My father was upon us. Instinctively I murmured, though no one heard me, "I am done for." I was not, however. My father used constantly to refuse to let me do things which were quite clearly allowed by the more liberal charters granted me by my mother and grandmother, because he paid no heed to principles, and because in his sight there were no such things as rights of man. For some quite irrelevant reason, or for no reason at all, he would at the last moment prevent me from taking some particular walk, one so regular and so consecrated to my use that to deprive me of it was a clear breach of faith. Or again, as he had done this evening, long before the appointed hour he would snap out, "Run along up to bed now, no excuses." But then again, simply because he was devoid of principles, in my grandmother's sense, so he could not, properly speaking, be called inexorable. He looked at me for a moment with an air of annoyance and surprise, and then, when mamma had told him, not without some embarrassment, what had happened, said to her, "Go along with him, then. You said just now that you didn't feel like sleep, so stay in his room for a little. I don't need anything." "But, dear," my mother answered timidly, "whether or not I feel like sleep is not the point. We must not make the child accustomed—" "There's no question of making him accustomed," said my father, with a shrug of his shoulders. "You can see quite well that the child is unhappy. After all, we aren't jailers. You'll end by making him ill, and a lot of good that will do. There are 2 beds in his room. Tell Francoise to make up the big one for you, and stay beside him for the rest of the night. I'm off to bed, anyhow. I'm not nervous like you. Good night." It was impossible for me to thank my father. What he called my sentimentality would have exasperated him. I stood there, not daring to move. He was still confronting us, an immense figure in his white nightshirt, crowned with the pink and violet scarf of Indian cashmere, in which, since he had begun to suffer from neuralgia, he used to tie up his head, standing like Abraham in the engraving after Benozzo Gozzoli which Monsieur Swann had given me, telling Sarah that she must tear herself away from Isaac. Many years have passed since that night. The wall of the staircase, up which I had watched the light of his candle gradually climb, was long ago demolished, and in myself, too, many things have perished which, I imagined, would last forever, and new structures have arisen, given birth to new sorrows and new joys, which in those days I could not have foreseen, just as now the old are difficult of comprehension. It is a long time, too, since my father has been able to tell mamma to go with the child. Never again will such hours be possible for me, but of late I have been increasingly able to catch, if I listen attentively, the sound of the sobs which I had the strength to control in my father's presence, and which broke out only when I found myself alone with mamma. Actually, their echo has never ceased. It is only because life is now growing more and more quiet round about me that I hear them afresh, like those convent bells which are so effectively drowned during the day by the noises of the street that one would suppose them to have been stopped forever, until they sound out again through the silent evening air. Mamma spent that night in my room, when I had just committed a sin so deadly that I was waiting to be banished from the household. My parents gave me a far greater concession than I should ever have won as the reward of a good action. Even at the moment when it manifested itself in this crowning mercy, my father's conduct towards me was still somewhat arbitrary and regardless of my deserts, as was characteristic of him, and due to the fact that his actions were generally dictated by chance expediencies rather than based on any formal plan. And perhaps even what I call his strictness, when he sent me off to bed, deserved that title less, really, than my mother's or grandmother's attitude, for his nature, which in some respects differed more than theirs from my own, had probably prevented him from guessing until then how wretched I was every evening, a thing which my mother and grandmother knew well. But they loved me enough to be unwilling to spare me that suffering, which they hoped to teach me to overcome, so as to reduce my nervous sensibility and to strengthen my will. As for my father, whose affection for me was of another kind, I doubt if he would have shown so much courage, for as soon as he had grasped the fact that I was unhappy, he had said to my mother, "Go and comfort him." Mamma stayed all night in my room, and it seemed that she did not wish to mar by recrimination those hours, so different from anything that I had had a right to expect. For when Françoise, who guessed that something extraordinary must have happened when she saw Mamma sitting by my side, holding my hand and letting me cry unchecked, said to her, "But, madam, what is little master crying for?" She replied, "Why, Françoise, he doesn't know himself. It is his nerves. Make up the big bed for me quickly, and then go off to your own." And thus for the first time my unhappiness was regarded no longer as a fault for which I must be punished, but as an involuntary evil which had been officially recognized a nervous condition for which I was in no way responsible. I had the consolation that I need no longer mingle apprehensive scruples with the bitterness of my tears. I could weep henceforward without sin. I felt no small degree of pride either in Françoise's presence at this return to humane conditions, which, not an hour after Mamma had refused to come up to my room and had sent the snubbing message that I was to go to sleep, raised me to the dignity of a grown-up person, brought me of a sudden to a sort of puberty of sorrow, to emancipation from tears. I ought then to have been happy. I was not. It struck me that my mother had just made a first concession which must have been painful to her, that it was a first step down from the ideal she had formed for me, and that for the first time she, with all her courage, had to confess herself beaten. It struck me that if I had just scored a victory it was over her, that I had succeeded, as sickness or sorrow or age might have succeeded, in relaxing her will, in altering her judgment. That this evening opened a new era must remain a black date in the calendar. And if I had dared now, I should have said to Mamma, "No, I don't want you. You mustn't sleep here." But I was conscious of the practical wisdom, of what would be called nowadays the realism with which she tempered the ardent idealism of my grandmother's nature, and I knew that, now the mischief was done, she would prefer to let me enjoy the soothing pleasure of her company and not to disturb my father again. Certainly my mother's beautiful features seemed to shine again with youth that evening, as she sat gently holding my hands and trying to check my tears. But, just for that reason, it seemed to me that this should not have happened. Her anger would have been less difficult to endure than this new kindness which my childhood had not known. I felt that I had, with an impious and secret finger, traced a first wrinkle upon her soul, and made the first white hair show upon her head. This thought redoubled my sobs, and then I saw that Mamma, who had never allowed herself to go to any length of tenderness with me, was suddenly overcome by my tears, and had to struggle to keep back her own. Then, as she saw that I had noticed this, she said to me, with a smile, "Why, my little buttercup, my little canary boy, he's going to make Mamma as silly as himself if this goes on. Look, since you can't sleep, and Mamma can't either, we mustn't go on in this stupid way. We must do something. I'll get one of your books." But I had none there. "Would you like me to get out the books now that your grandmother is going to give you for your birthday? Just think it over first, and don't be disappointed if there is nothing new for you then." I was only too delighted, and Mamma went to find a parcel of books in which I could not distinguish, through the paper in which it was wrapped, any more than its squareness and size, but which, even at this first glimpse, brief and obscure as it was, bade fair to eclipse already the paint-box of last New Year's Day and the silkworms of the year before. It contained La Mère au Diable, François Le Champy, Le Petit Fedette, and Le Maître Sonner. My grandmother, as I learned afterwards, had at first chosen Mussel's poems, a volume of Rousseau and Indiana, for while she considered light reading as unwholesome as sweets and cakes, she did not reflect that the strong breath of genius must have upon the very soul of a child an influence at once more dangerous and less quickening than those of fresh air and country breezes upon his body. But when my father had seemed almost to regard her as insane on learning the names of the books she proposed to give me, she had journeyed back by herself to Jouy-le-Vicomte to the booksellers, so that there should be no fear of my not having my present in time. It was a burning hot day, and she had come home so unwell that the doctor had warned my mother not to allow her again to tire herself in that way, and had there fallen back upon the 4 pastoral novels of George Sand. "My dear," she had said to mamma, "I could not allow myself to give the child anything that was not well written." The truth was that she could never make up her mind to purchase anything from which no intellectual profit was to be derived, and, above all, that profit which good things bestowed on us by teaching us to seek our pleasures elsewhere than in the barren satisfaction of worldly wealth. Even when she had to make someone a present of the kind called useful, when she had to give an armchair or some table silver or a walking stick, she would choose antiques, as though their long desuetude had effaced from them any semblance of utility, and fitted them rather to instruct us in the lives of the men of other days than to serve the common requirements of our own. She would have liked me to have in my room photographs of ancient buildings or of beautiful places, but at the moment of buying them, and for all that the subject of the picture had an aesthetic value of its own, she would find that vulgarity and utility had too prominent a part in them through the mechanical nature of their reproduction by photography. She attempted by a subterfuge, if not to eliminate altogether their commercial banality, at least to minimize it, to substitute for the bulk of it what was art still, to introduce, as it might be, several thicknesses of art. Instead of photographs of Chartres Cathedral, of the fountains of St. Cloud, or of Vesuvius, she would inquire of Swann whether some great painter had not made pictures of them, and preferred to give me photographs of Chartres Cathedral after Corot, of the fountains of St. Cloud after Hubert Robert, and of Vesuvius after Turner, which were a stage higher in the scale of art. But although the photographer had been prevented from reproducing directly the masterpieces or the beauties of nature, and had there been replaced by a great artist, he resumed his odious position when it came to reproducing the artist's interpretation. Accordingly, having to reckon again with vulgarity, my grandmother would endeavor to postpone the moment of contact still further. She would ask Swann if the picture had not been engraved, preferring, when possible, old engravings with some interest of association apart from themselves, such, for example, as show us a masterpiece in a state in which we can no longer see it today, as Morgan's print of the Cenacolo of Leonardo before it was spoiled by restoration. It must be admitted that the results of this method of interpreting the art of making presents were not always happy. The idea which I formed of Venice from a drawing by Titian which is supposed to have the lagoon in the background was certainly far less accurate than what I have since derived from ordinary photographs. We could no longer keep count in the family, when my great aunt tried to frame an indictment of my grandmother, Of all the armchairs she had presented to married couples, young and old, which, on a first attempt to sit down upon them, had at once collapsed beneath the weight of their recipient. But my grandmother would have thought it sordid to concern herself too closely with the solidity of any piece of furniture in which could still be discerned a flourish, a smile, a brave conceit of the past. And even what in such pieces supplied a material need, since it did so in a manner to which we are no longer accustomed, was as charming to her as one of those old forms of speech in which we can still see traces of a metaphor whose fine point has been worn away by the rough usage of our modern tongue. In precisely the same way, the pastoral novels of George Sand, which she was giving me for my birthday, were regular lumber rooms of antique furniture, full of expressions that have fallen out of use and returned as imagery, such as one finds now only in country dialects. And my grandmother had bought them in preference to other books, just as she would have preferred to take a house that had a Gothic dovecote, or some other such piece of antiquity as would have a pleasant effect on the mind, filling it with a nostalgic longing for impossible journeys through the realms of time. Mamma sat down by my bed. She had chosen Francois Le Champi, whose reddish cover and incomprehensible title gave it a distinct personality in my eyes and a mysterious attraction. I had not then read any real novels. I had heard it said that George Sand was a typical novelist. That prepared me in advance to imagine that Francois Le Champi contained something inexpressibly delicious. The course of the narrative, where it tended to arouse curiosity or melt to pity, certain modes of expression which disturb or sadden the reader, and which, with a little experience, he may recognize as common form in novels, seemed to me then distinctive. For to me a new book was not one of a number of similar objects, but was like an individual man, unmatched, and with no cause of existence beyond himself, an intoxicating whiff of the peculiar essence of Francois Le Champi. Beneath the everyday incidents, the commonplace thoughts and hackneyed words, I could hear, or overhear, an intonation, a rhythmic utterance, fine and strange. The action began. To me it seemed all the more obscure because in those days, when I read to myself, I used often, while I turned the pages, to dream of something quite different. And to the gaps which this habit made in my knowledge of the story, more were added by the fact that when it was Mamma who was reading to me aloud, she left all the love scenes out. And so all the odd changes which take place in the relations between the miller's wife and the boy, changes which only the birth and growth of love can explain, seemed to me plunged and steeped in a mystery, the key to which, as I could readily believe, lay in that strange and pleasant-sounding name of Champy, which draped the boy who bore it, I knew not why, in its own bright color, purpurate and charming. If my mother was not a faithful reader, she was, none the less, admirable when reading a work in which she found the note of true feeling, by the respectful simplicity of her interpretation, and by the sound of her sweet and gentle voice. It was the same in her daily life, when it was not works of art, but men and women whom she was moved to pity or admire. It was touching to observe with what deference she would banish from her voice, her gestures, from her whole conversation, now the note of joy, which might have distressed some mother who had long ago lost a child, now the recollection of an event or anniversary which might have reminded some old gentleman of the burden of his years, now the household topic which might have bored some young man of letters. And so, when she read aloud the prose of George Sand, prose which is everywhere redolent of that generosity and moral distinction which mamma had learned from my grandmother to place above all other qualities in life, and which I was not to teach her until much later to refrain from placing in the same way above all other qualities in literature, taking pains to banish from her voice any weakness or affectation which might have blocked its channel for that powerful stream of language, she supplied all the natural tenderness, all the lavish sweetness which they demanded to phrases which seemed to have been composed for her voice, and which were all, so to speak, within her compass. She came to them with the tone that they required, with the cordial accent which existed before they were, which dictated them, but which is not to be found in the words themselves, and by these means she smoothed away, as she read on, any harshness there might be, or discordance in the tenses of verbs, endowing the imperfect and the preterite with all the sweetness which there is in generosity, all the melancholy which there is in love, guided the sentence that was drawing to an end towards that which was waiting to begin, now hastening, now slackening the pace of the syllables so as to bring them, despite their difference of quantity, into a uniform rhythm, and breathed into this quite ordinary prose a kind of life, continuous and full of feeling. My agony was soothed. I let myself be borne upon the current of this gentle night on which I had my mother by my side. I knew that such a night could not be repeated, that the strongest desire I had in the world, namely, to keep my mother in my room through the sad hours of darkness, ran too much counter to general requirements and to the wishes of others for such a concession as had been granted me this evening to be anything but a rare and casual exception. Tomorrow night I should again be the victim of anguish, and mamma would not stay by my side. But when these storms of anguish grew calm, I could no longer realize their existence. Besides, tomorrow evening was still a long way off. I reminded myself that I should still have time to think about things, albeit that remission of time could bring me no access of power, albeit the coming event was in no way dependent upon the exercise of my will, and seemed not quite inevitable, only because it was still separated from me by this short interval.